The rain came down the way bad decisions do quietly at first, then all at once until there was no avoiding what you'd walked into. Claire Donovan had been driving for 6 hours when she turned onto Millhaven's main street, and by the time the GPS announced she'd arrived, the sky had gone the color of a bruise left untreated. She pulled the minivan to the curb and sat with the engine running, looking at the house through a windshield that kept blurring no matter how fast the wipers moved. She told herself it was just the rain. The listing had called it a 1932 Craftsman with original character. What it had failed to mention was that the character in question belonged to something that had given up. The porch sagged on the left side like a shoulder turned away from a conversation. Two of the front windows were covered with boards that had warped away from their nails, letting in small triangles of dark. The paint, what remained of it, was the grey-white of old newsprint peeling in long vertical strips, as though the house was shedding its own skin. A realtor's lockbox hung from the front door handle, swinging slightly in a wind Claire couldn't feel from inside the car. In the back seat, Maya had her headphones on and her knees pulled to her chest, and her face turned toward her own window, watching the town she hadn't asked to move to. Eli sat beside her with his face pressed almost to the glass, breath fogging a small circle, and he was the one who spoke first. "Is that it?" Claire cut the engine. "That's it." A silence that had weight to it settled over the three of them. Eli unfogged his window with his sleeve and looked harder, like better looking might change what was there. Maya didn't turn around. The key from the lockbox was stiff in the front door, and Claire had to lean into it with her shoulder before the lock gave. The door swung inward, and the smell reached them before anything else: damp wood and closed-up air, and something older underneath something that had been sitting in the walls for years, waiting to be disturbed. Claire stepped in first, her sneakers leaving prints in a fine layer of dust on the hardwood floor. The foyer was narrow, with a staircase rising along the left wall, and a hallway stretching back toward what she assumed was the kitchen. A water stain bloomed across the ceiling above them, yellow-brown at the edges and darker at its center, the shape of a continent on an old map. Eli came in behind her, already scanning the space with the focused attention of a kid who builds things in his head before he builds them with his hands. Maya crossed the threshold, last stopping just inside the doorway, one hand still on the doorframe, as though maintaining the option to step back out. "It smells like a basement," Maya said. "It'll air out." Claire moved toward the staircase, running her hand along the newel post, which was solid at least. "Let's see the upstairs." She was 3 steps up when she heard it, a sound like a gunshot, short and definitive, and then Maya's voice stripped of its teenager's armor. "Mom." Claire spun around. Maya's left leg had disappeared through the 3rd step up to her knee, the rotten wood collapsing under her weight, jagged edges catching on her jeans. Eli stood at the bottom of the stairs with his mouth open. Claire was back down the 2 steps and kneeling beside her daughter, before she'd fully processed, moving her hands around Maya's calf, feeling for damage. "Don't move. Tell me if it hurts." "It doesn't hurt. It's embarrassing." But Maya's voice had that thin quality it got when she was working to keep it steady, and her hands were gripping the intact step beside her so tightly the knuckles had gone pale. Claire eased her leg up and out carefully, the splintered wood scraping along the denim, and Maya stood on the landing and looked down at the hole in the stair, and then looked at Claire with an expression that didn't have a simple name. It wasn't anger, it wasn't fear exactly. It was something more exhausted than either of those things. "I'll carry anything we need up and down," Claire said. "We'll go around the outside of each step for tonight." Maya turned and walked up the remaining stairs, testing each one before committing her weight, and didn't say another word about it. Eli looked at the hole in the step and then looked up at Claire with the careful face he'd been wearing for the past 6 months. The face that was doing the work his age shouldn't have required of him. "It's just 1 step. The rest are probably okay." "The rest are probably okay," Claire agreed, and she held the agreement in her chest for a moment, because sometimes that was all you could do, take the smallest reasonable true thing and hold on to it. That night, the three of them lay in sleeping bags in the living room because the bedrooms hadn't been assessed yet, and the upstairs smelled worse than the downstairs. And Eli had found evidence of something living in the wall of the back bedroom that neither of them wanted to define more specifically. Claire had positioned 3 pots and a large mixing bowl to catch the active drips from the ceiling, and the rain outside and the irregular percussion inside made a kind of accidental music that was either peaceful or maddening, depending on how long you'd been awake listening to it. Eli fell asleep first, which he always did, dropping into unconsciousness with the uncomplicated speed of someone who hadn't yet learned to lie awake cataloging everything that could go wrong. Maya stayed facing the ceiling with her headphones on but not playing anything. Claire could tell because the little orange light on the side wasn't lit. She was just wearing them, using them as a wall. Claire lay between her children in the dark and did the math she'd been doing since Portland. The math she'd promised herself she'd stop doing at night, because nothing good happened to numbers after 10 o'clock. $47,000. The entire yield of 6 years of joint savings and 1 house sale and 1 attorney's negotiation. And she had spent $44,500 of it on what the listing called original character, and what she was now calling a structural argument against optimism. The remaining $8,500 sat in a checking account, like a person standing on 1 foot waiting to fall. She had a freelance contract that paid $2,200 a month, and she had a spreadsheet with 2 pages of repairs ranked by urgency, and she had 2 children who were depending on her to have known what she was doing when she signed the papers. She had not entirely known what she was doing. 6 months before, she had sat across from her attorney in a glass-walled conference room in Portland with a pen in her hand and a document in front of her. And the attorney had leaned forward and said in the careful voice of someone delivering bad news, "They've delivered before. Once you sign, the Portland house goes to him. Are you certain you don't want to contest that?" Claire had looked at the document and then passed it out through the glass wall at the hallway, where 2 paralegals were eating lunch from paper bags and laughing at something on a phone living lives that had nothing to do with hers. She thought about what a contested house sale would cost in attorney fees in time, in the particular cruelty of making her children watch their parents fight over square footage. "I'm certain," she said and signed. She had not been entirely certain. What she had been was tired, in a way that went past the body into something structural. The way a building can be tired, its joints loosening over years, until one season the whole thing lists 6 inches to one side, and nobody's surprised. Her marriage to Greg had been listing for 3 years before she knew why. And once she knew why, once she understood that Greg and Carla had been meeting for lunch and then dinner, and then weekends away for the better part of 2 years, while Claire worked late on brand campaigns, and took the kids to soccer, and made grocery lists and assumed they were simply going through a quiet season. Once she understood all of that, the tiredness had a name, and naming it didn't make it lighter, it made it specific. Specific weight is harder to carry than vague weight. The Hartwell house had appeared in her inbox as a listing forward from a real estate agent in Mill Haven she'd contacted on a restless Tuesday night 3 months into the limbo of the divorce proceedings. She'd grown up 40 minutes from Mill Haven, had visited it as a child, had driven through it on the way to her grandmother's. The listing showed a craftsman exterior, a large oak in the backyard, a treehouse visible in the upper right corner of one photo. The price was $44,500, which was the kind of number that made you look for the missing digit. The agent had explained estate sale, elderly owner, needing to liquidate quickly to manage a spouse's ongoing medical care property sat vacant for 2 years. Claire had looked at the photos for 40 minutes before she closed the laptop. She had opened the laptop again at midnight and looked for another hour. She had called the agent the next morning. She told herself she was being practical. She told herself she was being smart. She told Diane she was being brave. Diane, who had known her since college, had paused before responding. And that pause had contained something Claire hadn't asked for and hadn't been able to unhear. Are you sure you're not just running towards something far enough away that the thing behind you can't follow? Lying on the floor of the living room, with the rain finding its way through 3 separate spots in the ceiling, Claire thought about that question for the 400th time. She still didn't have a clean answer, but she thought of the moment she'd signed the purchase agreement, not the attorney's office. A different pen, a different table, a different document. And she thought of how her hand had not shaken, how she had felt for the first time in 18 months, like she was in motion under her own power, rather than being moved by something else. She reached for her phone on the floor beside her sleeping bag and found enough signal to call Diane. "Talk to me." Diane picked up on the second ring the way she always did, as though she'd been waiting. "How bad is it? Remember when I said it needed some work?" "I remember you said that, yes. I was describing a different house in my head. The one I was imagining, not the one I bought." Diane didn't laugh, which was one of the things Claire loved about her. "Define bad." The third stair swallowed Maya's leg tonight. "There are at least 3 active leaks in the living room ceiling. I found what I believe is evidence of wildlife in the back bedroom wall, and I am choosing not to investigate further until morning." Claire kept her voice low, her eyes on the lump of Eli's sleeping bag, the steady rise and fall of his back. "I called a home inspector before I bought this. I need you to understand that I did the responsible thing. And either he missed approximately everything, or he saw it and chose not to put it in the report, which makes him a liar with a license. Can you get your money back?" "I used everything. If I walk away now, we have nothing. Nowhere to go back to, nothing to go toward." She pressed her palm flat against the dusty hardwood floor as though testing whether it would hold. "I can't let the kids see me fall apart. Maya's barely speaking to me as it is. And Eli is trying so hard to be okay that it's breaking my heart in a different direction." The silence on the line was the kind that meant Diane was choosing her next words with real care, which she rarely needed to do. "You know what I've been thinking about? I dug out an old photo album last week. One of those from your wedding. And in every photo from that day, you have the face of someone doing the right thing because they're supposed to, not because they want to. Capable and competent and completely somewhere else." A beat. "You don't have that face in the photo you sent me last week. The one in front of the house. I look terrified in that photo." "Yes, but you look like yourself." Another beat. "That's not nothing, Claire." After she hung up, Claire lay in the dark for a long time. The rain began to ease. The dripping slowed. Eli made a small sound in his sleep that was almost a word but wasn't. She thought about what Diane had said and turned it over slowly, looking at it from different angles. The way you look at something you're afraid to put down because you might not find it again. She hadn't run away from Portland. She had run toward a version of herself that didn't yet exist but might if she could make something work in a place where nothing currently worked. The distinction was small, but it was load-bearing. She fell asleep on the floor of the Hartwell house and didn't dream of Portland once. She was up before the children, which was less about intention than about the way anxiety wakes you early and stands over you until you get moving. She found a broom in the hall closet that had somehow outlasted the decade and started in on the kitchen floor, pushing accumulated grit and dead leaves and years of settled dust into a pile in the corner while the gray light strengthened outside the window. By the time she'd worked her way to the far wall, the pile was impressive in a grim sort of way, a physical record of how long the house had been waiting for someone to come back to it. She swept it into a trash bag and tied the bag and set it by the back door and stood back and looked at what she had uncovered. Original tile floor, a pattern of cream and forest green that was dirty but intact, running in a diagonal grid toward the counter. She crouched down and scraped at a corner with her fingernail, and the tile came up clean beneath the grime, still bright after 9 decades of being stewed on. She was still crouching there when Eli appeared in the doorway in his socks and sleep-tangled hair, looking at the floor, then at the trash bag, then at her. "Did you find something? Original tile from 1932. She sat back on her heels. "Still good." He came and crouched beside her, studying the exposed corner she'd cleaned with the same serious attention he gave to structural problems, inventorying what was there. "If the floor's original and it's still good, what else might be original and still good?" She looked at him. He was 10 years old and he was asking the question she needed to be asking. "That's a good question." "I think the treehouse is original," he said. "I want to check it this morning." After breakfast, she set up the camping stove on the cleared stretch of counter and made pancakes from a box she'd packed in the cooler. And when Maya came downstairs, still in yesterday's clothes, still carrying herself like someone moving through weather, Claire slid a plate across the improvised table and didn't say anything about the fact that Maya hadn't said good morning. Maya sat down and ate 3 pancakes without a word, and then she looked at the tile floor and said, "That's actually kind of beautiful." And Claire took that as the morning's small victory and didn't push it further. After breakfast, she found the listing for Marcus Webb in the notes she'd made before the move. The hardware store owner had mentioned him twice in a single phone call, which she'd taken as a meaningful endorsement. She called from the back porch, standing in the weak September sun, watching Eli circle the oak tree in the yard like a surveyor. Marcus arrived the following morning. He drove a truck that had seen serious use dents that had been left as dents rather than repaired tools organized in the bed, with the particular neatness of someone who depends on being able to find things in the dark. He was about her age, maybe a year or two older, with capable hands, and the kind of watchful calm that belongs to people who've learned to look at a situation before reacting to it. He went through the house the way she imagined a doctor goes through a chart, methodically room by room, touching walls and testing floors and crouching to examine the space beneath the stairs without any readable expression. Claire followed him and did not speak because she sensed that speaking would interrupt something. Eli followed both of them and also did not speak, which was unusual enough that Claire glanced down at him twice to confirm he was still there. He was. He was taking notes in the small spiral notebook he carried everywhere. Maya watched from the kitchen doorway until Marcus reached the landing of the second floor and stopped to examine the banister, pressing his hand against it at different points, finding the places where it moved when it shouldn't. Then she went back upstairs without comment. In the kitchen, Marcus put a yellow notepad on the camp table and wrote numbers for 15 minutes. Claire sat across from him and did not look at the numbers while he wrote them. When he turned the pad to face her, she looked. The total at the bottom was the kind of number that makes the space behind your sternum go briefly empty. "The foundation is solid," he said. "That's the most important thing. Everything built after the foundation can be rebuilt. The foundation itself is original and it's holding." He tapped the pad. "But the roof comes first. Without a sealed roof, everything else you do inside is a temporary measure. You'll be undoing it every time it rains." "How much is the roof?" He pointed to the line on the pad. She looked at it. She looked at the remaining lines. She looked at the total again. "I can't do that all at once," she said. The sentence was harder to say than she'd expected. She had spent considerable effort not saying things like that out loud. "I know." He didn't offer anything else for a moment, and the restraint of it struck her. He wasn't filling the silence to make himself comfortable. He was letting her be in the information. "I should tell you I'm booked on other projects through the end of October. I can do weekends here and I can prioritize the roof. For the rest of it, I can source materials through my supplier at my contractor rate, which is cheaper than retail. And I can teach you and the kids enough that you can do the simpler work yourselves. That cuts the labor cost significantly. What's your exchange rate for design work?" He looked up. "I'm a graphic designer. I run my own studio, or I did. I'm rebuilding it here." She gestured at the laptop setup on the corner of the camp table. Your truck has a logo that looks like it was made in 15 minutes on a free website. Your company name is in a font I used in college. I'm guessing your website is in a similar condition. Something shifted at the corners of his expression that wasn't quite a smile. My website is functional. That's a low bar. My clients don't care about logos. Your potential clients do, the ones you haven't landed yet. She held his gaze. I'll redesign your full brand identity. Logo, business cards, vehicle graphics, website. In exchange for labor credit against the project. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that was doing real work. My company's been losing bids, 3 in the last quarter, all to newer contractors with better presentation materials. He said it without visible frustration, just a clean statement of a fact he'd been sitting with. If your work is what it should be, that's worth something real. My work is what it should be. Then I'll look at your portfolio before I commit. That's fair. She pulled up her work on the laptop and turned it toward him. And he looked at it with the same quiet attention he'd given the house methodically without performance. After 4 minutes, he closed the laptop and slid it back to her. Deal, he said. Weekends on the roof starting next Saturday. I want the work order in writing and the design timeline agreed in advance. I'll have a draft agreement to you by Friday. He stood gathering the notepad, and that was when Eli materialized from somewhere near the hallway with his spiral notebook open and his pencil at the ready. If you replace the stair treads, Eli said, what wood would you match to the existing grain? Marcus looked at him. He looked at the stairs. He looked back at Eli. Douglas fir, same species as the original risers. Eli wrote this down with obvious satisfaction. That's what I thought. Marcus glanced at Claire with an expression she couldn't fully read. I'll see you Saturday, he said, and went out the front door. And Claire heard the truck start and pull away. And she sat at the camp table for a moment in the quiet he'd left behind, feeling something she hadn't felt in 6 months. Not hope exactly. Hope was too large and too fragile for what this was. It was smaller than hope and more durable. It was the particular feeling of a first viable plan. Eleanor Hartwell arrived on the 4th day, which was a Wednesday. The sky having finally given up on rain in favor of a thin autumn sun that made the house look better from the outside than it had any right to. Patrice, her granddaughter, drove her in a small silver sedan and helped her up the broken front path with a steadying hand at her elbow. But Eleanor herself walked with the deliberate pace of someone who has decided to take as much time as they need and doesn't feel the need to explain that to anyone. She was 80 years old and dressed as though she'd once cared very much about how she looked and still cared enough to remember how. Her white hair was set precisely. Her posture was the kind that takes a lifetime to maintain. Claire opened the door before Eleanor reached it. Eleanor looked at Claire for a long moment. She looked at the house behind her. The exposed staircase, the ceiling stain visible from the doorway. The pot still arranged on the floor from the last rain, a still life of everything that needed doing. Then she looked at Claire again, and her expression had the quality of an assessment in progress. I sold this house because I needed money for my husband's medical care, and because my attorney told me the estate needed to be simplified. Her voice was unhurried, the voice of someone who has given up softening things for the comfort of the listener. But I wanted to see the face of whoever bought it before I made my peace with the decision. If you came here to flip it to tear out the original work and put in the kind of things they show on television, I'd rather know that now. Claire didn't look at the house behind her, or at the pots on the floor, or at anything that might have offered cover. I came here because this was the only place left that had room for us. Eleanor was quiet for 5 seconds. 10. Then she reached into the large bag she carried and produced a book, thick, leather-bound, worn smooth along the spine where it had been handled for decades. This is the house diary. Every repair, every modification, every seasonal maintenance note from 1935 forward, where the water main runs, Which window frames swell in August? What mix was used for the original plaster? She held it out. It will tell you more about this house than any inspection ever could. Claire took it with both hands. The cover had the weight of something that had mattered to someone for a long time. Thank you. This is truly invaluable. It belongs with the house. Eleanor moved past her into the foyer, looking up at the ceiling stain down at the tile floor along the staircase with its missing tread. Something moved in her face that wasn't grief exactly, but occupied the same neighborhood. Arthur, my husband, handled all the maintenance for 40 years. After he was diagnosed, things started to fall apart faster than I could keep up with alone. She said it simply without apology. I suppose that's what happens. The things we maintain together stop being maintainable alone. Maya appeared at the top of the stairs, looking down through the gap in the banister. She had a folded piece of paper in her hand, and her expression was the careful neutral she'd been wearing since Portland, the one that required effort to sustain. Who drew the things on my wall? Eleanor looked up at her. I did, 1945. My husband wanted to wallpaper over them eventually, and I kept finding reasons to put it off. A pause. Did they survive the wallpaper? Maya unfolded the paper, a charcoal rubbing she'd made of one of the drawings. A careful impression of the town's waterfront, as it had looked decades ago, every building rendered in precise, confident lines. They're under 3 layers of floral print, but they're fine. She came down 2 steps, favoring the wall side. You drew these when you were my age. Younger, 14, 15. I hadn't learned yet that walls weren't meant for that. Something lightened in Eleanor's expression. You have an artist's hands, the way you're holding that paper. Maya looked at her own hands, then back up. I used to draw, not much anymore. Creative wells go dry sometimes, Eleanor said. They fill back up when you're ready. You can't rush it and you can't force it. You just have to keep showing up to the page. Maya looked at the rubbing in her hands for a moment. And then she came down the rest of the stairs and sat at the bottom step, not the broken one, and smoothed the paper against her knee and didn't say anything else. But she didn't leave either. That evening, after Eleanor had gone, and the kids were managing what passed for dinner on the camping stove, Claire climbed to the attic with a flashlight, and the house diary opened to a page that mentioned storage trunks against the north wall. The attic was low-ceilinged and cobwebbed with the smell of a space that has been sealed for years, and the flashlight caught the eyes of something small that retreated behind a rafter. The trunks were exactly where the diary said there'd be 3 of them, large and old and dusty. The first 2 she opened, quickly assessing and closing old clothes beyond salvage holiday decorations, photo albums she set aside to look at when she had more light. It was the 3rd trunk that stopped her. Letters, dozens of them tied in bundles with ribbon that had gone fragile at the folds. And on top, an envelope she almost put back before the handwriting made her stop. She knew that handwriting. She had spent years reading it on birthday cards and recipe cards, and the backs of photographs tucked into the family albums her mother kept in the front closet. Her grandmother's hand, the loop slightly too large, the letters slightly too close together. The particular way she'd always made the capital H, like 2 ladders leaning toward each other. The envelope was addressed to Eleanor. It was sealed. Claire sat back on her heels in the attic dust and held the envelope in both hands and looked at it for a long time. She had not known her grandmother corresponded with Eleanor Hartwell. She had not known her grandmother had any connection to this specific house beyond what Eleanor had mentioned, that they'd been friends that her grandmother had visited. Whatever was in this envelope had been here through 2 years of vacancy, through Eleanor's departure, through the estate sale, and the transfer of ownership. It had been here waiting. She opened it. The letter was 3 pages handwritten, dated 4 months before her grandmother's death. It began without preamble in the middle of a thought. My dearest Eleanor, I find myself thinking about all the places that have held me, and yours is among the truest of them. The kitchen specifically, the way the light came through that east window in October. I have never told you this, but I used to think of that kitchen whenever I was afraid. Not the house I grew up in, not the house I raised my family in yours. That east window. Something about it always told me that the morning was still going to come. Claire read all 3 pages there in the attic, sitting in the dust with the flashlight balanced on a rafter nail, her knees starting to ache. On the final page near the end, a paragraph that made her read it twice, and then a third time. I sometimes think a house holds the echo of whoever loved it best. If any of my girls ever finds herself needing that east window, the light through it, the steadiness of it, I hope they find their way to you. I hope you let them in. That was always your gift, Eleanor, knowing when someone needed the door opened. Her grandmother had written this 4 months before dying, had written it to Eleanor and then never sent it or had sent it. And Eleanor had kept it, brought it back, tucked it into the trunk with the other letters. Claire couldn't know which. But her grandmother had imagined this or something close to it. Had imagined a version of her girls finding their way to this house, to this east-facing kitchen, to the particular quality of October light through a window that was currently boarded on the outside, but presumably still there. She sat in the dark attic of the Hartwell house and held her grandmother's letter, and felt something she did not have a word for. Not comfort exactly, and not grief, and not the particular species of loneliness that had followed her from Portland. Something older than all of those things. The feeling of a door that had been standing open for a long time, and walking through it and finding it was exactly where you were supposed to be. She was still in the attic when she heard Maya's voice from below. Not calling out, but just present. "Mom, the camping stove's acting up again. Can you come look at it?" Claire folded the letter carefully back into its envelope and tucked it into the pocket of her flannel shirt against her ribs. "Coming!" She called down and moved toward the hatch and climbed down into the lit hallway below where Maya was standing with her arms crossed, and her face doing that complicated thing it did when she wanted something but hadn't figured out how to want it out loud. The camping stove's igniter was sticking. Claire fixed it in 3 minutes. Maya stood at the counter watching her do it. When the burner caught, Maya said without turning from the stove, "There's a locked door in the back of the yard, separate from the house. Did you see it?" Claire thought of the letter in her pocket of her grandmother writing about the kitchen, the east window. "I saw it. I don't know what it is yet. There's a window on the side of it, painted shut, but you can see through the gap at the bottom." Maya stirred the pot on the burner slowly. "There's an easel in there and some kind of daybed. It looked like someone was using it and then just stopped." Claire stood in the kitchen that smelled of old wood and new possibility, with her grandmother's letter pressed against her ribs and a question forming in her chest that she didn't yet have the pieces to answer. And she looked at her daughter, who was standing at a camping stove in a ruin of a house that was also. She was beginning to understand a place that had been waiting for them specifically. "We'll ask Eleanor," Claire said. The pot came to a boil. The east-facing window above the sink caught the last amber light of the evening and held it longer than any other window in the house. 3 weeks into the renovation, the house looked worse than it had on arrival, which Marcus had warned her about and which she had intellectually accepted, and which still caught her off guard every morning when she walked through it. This was the demolition phase, the necessary destruction before anything could be built. And it had a logic to it that her brain understood while her stomach refused to. Walls she'd stood in front of 2 weeks ago were now open to the studs, their damaged drywall stacked in the rented dumpster at the curb. 2 sections of buckled flooring in the hallway had been pulled up entirely, leaving the subfloor exposed raw wood the color of old bone. The house had been stripped back to its argument to the essential question of whether its bones were worth building on. And the answer was still yes. But the yes required living inside the question for a while first. Marcus came on Saturdays and sometimes Sunday mornings, and he had the quality of someone who worked better when not being watched. So Claire had learned to work nearby rather than alongside him. A different room, a different task, close enough to ask questions and far enough to let him think. Eli operated under no such restraint, and had attached himself to Marcus with the patient persistence of someone who has decided where he wants to learn and is not going to be redirected. He carried things. He measured twice before asking Marcus to confirm. He asked questions that were never the expected questions. Questions that required Marcus to stop and actually think before answering, and Claire noticed that Marcus answered them fully without the simplified version adults usually give children, and that Eli absorbed these answers and filed them somewhere, and sometimes retrieved them 3 days later with a follow-up. On the third Saturday, Marcus was on the roof, and Eli was below in the yard, tasked with inventorying the salvaged lumber stacked against the fence when he looked up and called out, "How do you know when a board is still good?" Marcus's voice came down from above without a pause in the sound of his work. "Press your thumbnail into the end grain. If it goes in easy, the wood's compromised. If it takes real pressure, it's still sound." Eli pressed his thumbnail into the end grain of the nearest board. Then the next, working his way down the stack with systematic focus sorting as he went. Claire watched from the kitchen window and felt a fullness in her chest that was not uncomplicated relief and grief running alongside each other, the way rivers sometimes run parallel before they join. Her son had been starving for exactly this, for someone to teach him how to test whether something was still sound, and she had not known how to give it to him. And now someone was giving it to him sideways from a rooftop between tasks, and it was working. The design work for Marcus had begun in earnest during the second week. She built his brand from the structural logic up, starting with what his company actually was not. What the generic contractor template suggested, not the hard hat and hammer visual shorthand, but the particular quality of work she'd seen in the way he organized his truck bed, and in the answers he gave Eli, and in the small things he did without being asked, like relabeling the breaker box in her electrical panel in clear handwriting, so she'd be able to find things in an emergency. Web construction was not about speed or price. It was about work done right the first time by someone who understood what he was building and why it mattered. She built a logo around a compass rose, simplified to its essential geometry, oriented, precise with purpose. And when she showed it to him on a Saturday morning between roof sections, he looked at it for a full minute without speaking. "That's it," he said finally, and she knew from the brevity of it that she'd gotten something right. She was in the middle of the website architecture on a Tuesday afternoon when the freelance client called. She knew from the number, knew from the time of day. Her contact there called Tuesdays between 2 and 4 when he was managing bad news, and she let it ring twice before she picked up, because she wanted 2 rings worth of the world where it hadn't happened yet. The budget had been restructured. The project was being reduced in scope. Her monthly retainer was being cut by 60% effective the following billing cycle. She thanked him. She hung up. She opened the spreadsheet. The numbers were no longer a person standing on one foot. They were a person standing on one foot on a surface that was moving. She ran the revised projections 3 times, changing one variable each time, looking for the version where everything was okay. The roof work had gone over estimate by $4,000 because of what they'd found under the damaged sections. Not Marcus's fault, not anyone's fault. Just the house continuing to reveal itself. The electrical system update, which Tom Gallagher had assessed last week when he stopped by to help carry lumber, was going to cost $11,000 minimum and could not be deferred past winter. The $8,500 she'd started with was now $3,200, and the math did not work. She closed the laptop and sat at the camp table in the gutted kitchen with the original tile under her feet and the original plaster visible through the open wall studs, and thought about what was salvageable. The new local clients, the bookstore, the bakery, the bed and breakfast that had reached out after the tile post would bring in money, but not quickly. Not the kind of quickly that covered an $11,000 electrical job. Marcus came in from the yard tracking sawdust pulled off his gloves and looked at her face. He didn't ask what was wrong. He looked at the closed laptop and then back at her face and said, "The electrical quote came in. Tom sent it this morning. I know, he called me after. He sat down across from her without being invited, which he'd stopped waiting for 3 weeks ago. I want to say something, and I need you to hear it as a business conversation, not as charity. I'm listening. My sister has been running her contracting company's marketing on a shoestring since her business partner left last year. Her name's Dana. She does residential renovation in the Ashland area, and she's been losing bids because her presentation looks like she's smaller than she is. He put his gloves on the table between them. I already told her about your work. She wants to talk. If you take her on as a client between her retainer and the local accounts you're building here, you're close to solvent. Not comfortable, but functional. Claire looked at the gloves on the table, at the particular bluntness of the offer. Why didn't she reach out herself? Because I asked her to let me mention it first. Because I didn't want her calling out of nowhere and having you feel like I'd gone behind your back to set something up. A pause. I'm not managing you. I'm giving you information that's relevant to a problem I can see. Something about the directness of it. The refusal to soften it into something. It wasn't made her trust it in a way she might not have trusted gentleness. Tell her to call me, Claire said, Wednesday afternoon. He nodded and picked up his gloves and went back to work. And Claire opened the laptop again, and the numbers were still the same numbers, but they had a possible corridor through them, now narrow and requiring navigation, but there. The storm built for 2 days before it arrived, which the weather app had correctly predicted, and which Claire had attempted to prepare for by buying additional tarps, reinforcing the plastic sheeting over the unfinished roof section, and making sure the basement sump pump, which she had learned, existed only because the house diary mentioned it was functional. It was functional. It was also 20 years old and undersized for what the storm brought. The rain started at 3 in the afternoon on a Thursday and was serious by 4 and was something else entirely by 6. Marcus had left at noon before the worst of it, but he'd stayed long enough to help double secure the rooftops. The wind came from the northwest and found the house with what felt like specific intention pressing against the west-facing walls and finding every small breach. And within an hour, there were 2 new leaks in the living room ceiling that hadn't been there before, and the plastic sheeting over the unfinished roof section was billowing against its ties. Claire sent the kids upstairs to their rooms and went to the basement. The sump pump was running. The water was winning. It was coming in through 2 places in the foundation wall, not catastrophically but steadily spreading across the concrete floor in a dark advancing line. The water heater stood in the center of the floor, making a sound she didn't like, a periodic pop and hiss that suggested the water and the electrical components were conducting a negotiation she wanted no part of. She got Marcus on the phone. I need to know if the water heater is going to cause a problem. Get the circuit breaker for the heater tripped right now. Don't wait. His voice had the quality of someone who has handled emergencies before and knows that the first step is always the same. Stop. The thing that can get worse fast. She went to the breaker box labeled now in his clear handwriting. Found the right breaker, tripped it, went back to the basement. The hissing stopped. The water kept coming. She was positioning buckets and towels and watching the sump pump struggle when she realized she hadn't checked on Maya in 40 minutes. She called up the stairs. Nothing. She went up, checked the bathroom, the back bedroom, the small room at the end of the hall that Maya had claimed as a reading space. Empty. She stood in the upstairs hallway with the sound of the storm against the windows and a particular cold settling in her chest that had nothing to do with temperature. Eli was in his room with the door open, lying on his sleeping bag reading, and he looked up when she appeared in his doorway with that face. She left around 4. She said she was going to the library. In this weather? It was before it got bad. He sat up. She does it every week. They have the Wi-Fi. Claire stood in the doorway and counted back. 4 o'clock. 2 hours ago, before the worst of it. The library closed at 6 on Thursdays, which meant Maya had been out in the full force of the storm for at least some portion of this. She called Maya's number. Voicemailed the phone either dead or silenced. She called the library's main number and got a recording. She stood at the front window and watched the street, which was running with water along both gutters, and she made herself breathe at a rate that was functional rather than the rate her body was requesting. She called Marcus. He was at her door 11 minutes later, and she opened the door to tell him she was going to get in the car and drive the route to the library, and found Maya on the porch behind him. Maya was soaked to the core, her hair plastered flat. Her sneakers darkened to a solid wet mud on the hem of her jeans from where she'd stepped wrong at the curb. She was not crying. She was holding herself with a particular rigid stillness, the kind that is doing the work crying would normally do. Claire felt the relief hit her like a physical thing, followed immediately and almost simultaneously by the other thing. The thing that is the shadow side of relief in a parent, the anger that comes from fear that has nowhere else to go. Where were you? Your phone went to voicemail. It died. I was at the library. Maya stepped inside, dripping onto the floor. I lost track of time and then it started, and I didn't want to walk home in it, but then I had to. For 2 hours I didn't know where you were. I know, I'm sorry. But something in how she said it, not defiant, not defensive, but emptied out hollow in a way that wasn't quite remorse, stopped Claire from receiving it cleanly. Marcus had moved to the side of the hallway, present but not pressing, and Claire caught something in his expression, a particular stillness that she would understand later as recognition. You can't disappear without telling anyone, Claire pressed. You're 14. We're in a house with active flooding, and I didn't know where you were. I wasn't disappearing. The hollow quality in Maya's voice was filling with something else now, something that had pressure behind it. I was at the library because it's the only place with decent Wi-Fi. I was calling Dad. I do it every Thursday. Claire went quiet. He picked up. Maya looked at the wall rather than at her mother, her voice doing the precise controlled work of someone who has decided to say a thing and is going to say it and then be done with it. He picked up, and Carla walked through behind him, and I could see her in the background. I hung up. I just needed a minute. That's all. I needed to be somewhere that wasn't this house for a minute. The silence that followed had weight and shape. Eli had appeared at the top of the stairs and was sitting on the landing, listening, not pretending otherwise. Maya. Claire started toward her daughter, reaching. Maya didn't step back, but she went very still. Don't do the mom thing right now. Please, I'm okay. I just needed a minute, and now I'm home and I'm okay. The mom thing, Claire repeated, and her voice came out smaller than she intended, because what she'd heard in Maya's pleas was something that cut past anger and past relief into something older and harder. She's been carrying this every Thursday for how many weeks? She stopped reaching. She let her hands drop. Okay, she said quietly. Go change out of those clothes. I'll get you something hot. Maya went upstairs without another word. Marcus waited until her door had closed before he said low and even, she went home, in the storm, when she had somewhere else she could have stayed. He let that sit for a moment. That means something. Claire stood in the hallway of the Hartwell house and understood that the storm outside and the storm inside were two separate things, requiring two separate kinds of management, and that she was only equipped at the moment to handle one of them. She went to the kitchen and put water on the camping stove, and while she waited for it, she put her hands flat on the newly exposed counter and breathed. The water went on until midnight. Marcus stayed, and they worked the basement together. Buckets and the shop vacuum he had brought from his truck, the sump pump cycling on and off with increasing strain. Neither of them talked much, which was its own kind of communication. The understanding that some situations call for work rather than words. At some point, Eli appeared in the basement doorway in his raincoat, having apparently decided that watching was insufficient, and without being asked, he took the filled buckets up the stairs and emptied them in the backyard, making the trip over and over with the steady reliability of someone who needed to be useful, because it was the only thing that helped. After midnight, when the rain had thinned to a normal rain and the foundation was no longer actively flooding, Marcus sat on the basement stairs with his forearms on his knees and looked at the damage. The water heater was finished. The subfloor in two of the ground floor rooms had taken water and would need to be assessed in daylight. The sump pump had held but only barely and would need to be replaced before the next significant rain. "We can assess it properly in the morning," Marcus said. "It might look better dry." She looked at him. "You don't believe that?" "No," he said, "but it's still true that morning is better for assessment than midnight." After he left, after Eli had finally gone to sleep, Claire sat at the camp table in the kitchen alone with a battery lantern and her phone, and the house was quiet around her in the specific way things are quiet after a long, loud effort. She opened Instagram because it was the middle of the night and she was alone, and she needed somewhere to put this that wasn't internal. She typed without editing. "Tonight our renovation hit real bottom. The basement flooded, the water heater is dead, the floor took damage. We won't know the full extent of until morning. My daughter walked home alone in a storm because she needed to be somewhere that wasn't here, and I understood it, and that understanding hurt more than the flooding. Sometimes I wonder if I'm repairing this house to avoid asking whether some things can't be repaired." She pressed post and put the phone face down and did not look at it again. In the morning, Patrice's text came at 7:43. Her grandmother had been awake most of the night. She wanted Patrice to pass something along. Every renovation has a night like that one. She'd had 3 of them in this house over the decades. They're usually right before something shifts. She wants to know if she can come by this afternoon. Claire read the message twice. She thought about Eleanor at 80, awake at 3 in the morning, thinking about a house she'd sold to a woman she'd met 4 days before the storm. She texted back, "Tell her yes. Come for coffee. We'll figure out the water heater first." By 9 in the morning, there were 2 trucks in the driveway that hadn't been there at 8. Tom Gallagher arrived first with his electrician's bag and an extension cord long enough to reach the neighbor's exterior outlet, which he had apparently already called and arranged. Behind him came Linda from the hardware store with 2 industrial fans in the truck bed. Then Jim Peterson, the retired plumber from 2 streets over, who had read the Instagram post at 6 in the morning because he was 70 and didn't sleep past 5 anymore, and who had a replacement sump pump in his garage that he'd been meaning to donate to someone for 2 years. Claire stood on the front porch and watched them unload and felt something she hadn't expected. Something that was not rescue exactly, but was something close to what rescue becomes when you've already been doing everything you can and you still need more than you have. It was the specific relief of not being required to be sufficient alone. Patrice had called them. Not Eleanor, who was 80 and used a cane and had no business making 6 phone calls before 7 in the morning. But Patrice, who'd seen the post, who'd understood what it meant to someone who knew the Hartwell house, who'd pulled out her contacts list and started calling the people she knew, still cared about the place. Tom worked on the temporary electrical solution with the focused efficiency of someone who has done this particular kind of problem solving for 40 years. Jim replaced the sump pump in an hour flat, refusing to let Claire help on the grounds that a wrong connection would make things worse, and he could do it faster alone. When Claire asked why he'd come, he looked at the house, then back at her. "This house had people in it who showed up when it mattered. Seems right to return the favor." Marcus arrived at 10 and went directly to the roof section that had partially failed during the storm because there was a priority and he knew it, and the other things were being handled. And by evening, what had seemed like an insurmountable disaster at midnight had been contained, catalogued, and partially repaired by people who had no obligation to show up and had shown up anyway. The Harvest Festival arrived in mid-October, with the particular energy of a town that has been waiting all year to celebrate itself. Colored booths ran the length of Main Street, kettle corn and apple cider, and the smell of wood smoke threading between them. Claire had a booth shared with Marcus displaying the new web construction branding, alongside a portfolio of her own work and a small sign reading, "Foundation Design." By noon, she had 6 conversations that could become clients. By 2 o'clock, 2 of them had committed. But the moment she had not expected came in the early afternoon when Maya appeared on the small festival stage with a group of young local artists. Claire was watching from the booth when her daughter's name was announced, and she felt Marcus go still beside her in the particular way of someone also holding their breath. Before Maya had walked up those steps, her phone had buzzed in her pocket. Claire was too far away to see the screen, but she saw Maya look at it, hold it for 4 long seconds, and then slide it back into her pocket without answering. Greg's call or Carla's, or both the weekly negotiation with a life that had moved on without them. Maya climbed the steps. She stood at the microphone with an easel beside her, and she spoke for 2 minutes about finding Eleanor's drawings under the wallpaper, about what it had meant to discover that someone had made something beautiful in a place and then covered it up, and about deciding to make something again herself. Her voice found its steadiness as she went. She unveiled a charcoal drawing of the Hartwell house, not as it had been when they arrived, not as it fully was yet, but as it was in the process of becoming. She called it Uncovered. She did not look at Claire during any of it. This was hers, not theirs, and she needed to do it without the scaffolding of her parents watching. Claire understood this and looked anyway, and felt the particular grief and pride of watching your child do something hard and real and their own. That evening when the festival was packing up and the kids were somewhere in the crowd with new acquaintances, Claire told Marcus about the drawing, about Maya's phone, about the 4 seconds she'd held it before choosing the stage. Marcus was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when something had landed. "She didn't make the call she could have made," he said. "She made the one that was harder." He looked at the empty stage. "That's not nothing." The weeks between the festival and Thanksgiving moved at the particular pace of meaningful work, slow enough to feel and fast enough to matter. Maya's room was completed, first one wall preserved to show Eleanor's drawings. The other 3 painted a blue-gray that Maya had chosen with the decisive instinct of someone who knows exactly what they need, even when they haven't been able to say it. A window seat was installed below the east-facing window, the one that caught the same quality of morning light the kitchen window did. And Amaya took to drawing there in the early hours before school, which Claire knew because she was sometimes awake to see it. Eli's room came next with built-in shelving that he and Marcus had designed together, and that Eli had been present for every step of measuring and confirming and standing back to look, with the critical eye of a 10-year-old who cared about whether things were level. When the last shelf went in and Marcus handed Eli the level, and it showed true, Eli ran it across the surface 3 times to be sure. Then he looked up and said with the tone of someone rendering a professional judgment, "Good." Marcus didn't laugh, which was the exactly right response. It was on a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week of November, with the frost just beginning to appear in the mornings and the renovation finally in its finishing stretch, that Eli came downstairs before Claire and picked up the metal box from the kitchen counter, where it had been sitting since the night of the storm present, and unaddressed, like a question she hadn't been ready to answer. She had known it was there. She had walked past it every day for 6 weeks. The reason she hadn't opened it was not practical but psychological. It had come from under the floor of a house that was still revealing itself to her, and she'd understood without articulating it that she needed to know more about the house before she was ready to know what the house had been keeping. "Are we going to open this?" Eli asked. She got a flathead screwdriver and worked the corroded clasp until it gave. The lid lifted. Inside, folded and wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had kept out 90 years of moisture, were 2 things. A set of architectural drawings, the ink still legible, showing the house's original floor plan and elevations, signed in the bottom right corner, in the careful hand of someone who knew the signature would matter. Robert Hartwell. September 1932. And a small paper envelope, water-stained along one edge but intact, with a single line written on its face, "For whoever tends this garden next." Inside the envelope, seeds, hard and dark, still viable looking. The kind of thing that either was or wasn't, depending entirely on what the ground had to say about it. Eli looked at the seeds in Claire's palm. Rose seeds, has to be. He put them in there in 1932 and sealed them up and hid them under the floor. He turned this over in his mind. He must have known the house would last that long. You don't hide something under the floor if you think the floor is going to go. He looked at the architectural drawings, at the precision of the lines, the care in the notation. He built it to last. He just didn't know who was going to be living in it. She looked at her son. He was 10 years old, and he had just said the thing she had been trying to locate for months. You build the thing as well as you can, and you leave something in it for whoever comes next, and you trust the floor to hold. She took the box and the seeds and the drawings to Eleanor that afternoon. Eleanor unwrapped the oilcloth and looked at the drawings for a long time, at the signature in the corner, at the floor plan of the house that her husband's father had built and that she had lived in for 52 years. Her hands were very still on the paper. Frank would have loved this, she said, her voice level and quiet. The voice of someone who has learned to say true things in a steady register because the alternative is not saying them. He still knows roses. Specific things go and other things hold on. He knows my name on most days. He knows roses always. Claire turned the seed envelope over in her hands. We'd like to plant them in the front along the fence line. In the spring if they take. Eleanor looked at her for a moment, and then she reached into her coat and produced a small bundle wrapped in a square of velvet, the kind of wrapping that means an object has been carried close for a long time. Inside was a key on a length of silver chain brass, darkened with age, old-fashioned. In its profile, the kind of key that belongs to a door that was built before locks became standardized. The original house key, Eleanor said. Frank had it made into a necklace for me on our 40th anniversary. I've been carrying it since I left. She placed it in Claire's hand, closing Claire's fingers around it. The house has chosen you. Not in any mystical sense, I don't mean it that way. I mean, you looked at what this place was and you saw what it could still be. That requires a specific kind of vision, and not everyone has it. Frank's father had it. Frank had it. You have it. A pause. The key should stay with the house. Claire held the key and the seed envelope in the same hand the old brass worm from Eleanor's coat, and didn't try to give it back. It was the following Tuesday when Eleanor arrived alone, Patrice having dropped her at the curb and driven away, which meant Eleanor had arranged it that way deliberately. She stood at the front door with her cane and the expression of someone who has been preparing to do a hard thing long enough that the preparation has gone quiet inside her. Claire opened the door before she knocked and saw immediately where Eleanor's eyes went past the repaired hallway and through the kitchen and out the back window toward the small outbuilding at the far end of the yard. Eleanor moved through the house without being led and out the back door into the yard, walking toward the outbuilding with the deliberate pace of someone who has given themselves permission to take this at the speed it requires. She reached into her coat pocket and produced a key. The door swung inward on hinges that were stiff but not rusted, and the smell that came out was linseed oil and cold air. And something underneath those things, a smell belonging to work that had been done here and to the particular quality of attention that leaves a trace in a space. The studio was small, maybe 12 by 14, with a north-facing skylight providing even directionless light. A drafting table stood against the far wall, its surface still holding a jar of brushes and 2 small bottles of ink dried to dark residue along their rims. An easel in the corner held a canvas that had been turned to face the wall. Along the right side, deep shelving held flat files and folio cases and the organized residue of decades of illustration work. And against the left wall, a wooden chair, simple and straight-backed, positioned at an angle to the drafting table that suggested someone who sat in it had been oriented not toward the work, but toward the person doing the work. Frank's chair. Eleanor stood in the center of the room and looked at it. She didn't touch it. She stood with her cane and the particular stillness of someone who has arrived somewhere they didn't know if they'd be able to stand being. I illustrated 23 books in this room, she said. Frank sat in that chair and read while I worked. Sometimes we didn't speak for hours. The being there was the point. She looked at the easel with its canvas turned to the wall. After his diagnosis, I came in here once. I sat down at the table and picked up a brush and held it and understood that I didn't know who I was doing it for anymore. He couldn't remember the books, couldn't remember that I'd made them. A pause. I locked the door, and I didn't come back. Maya was standing in the doorway behind them. Claire hadn't heard her follow. She stood at the threshold without crossing it, looking at the room. With the focused attention she gave things she was deciding whether to let matter to her. Eleanor turned, saw her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The 14-year-old and the 80-year-old occupying the same threshold, the one that has to do with loss and making things. And the question of whether it is possible to keep doing one after the other has been taken. I stopped drawing after my parents split up, Maya said. Not performing the admission, not softening it. Just stating it as fact with the direct, undecorated honesty that was her most consistent quality. I kept picking up the pencil and then putting it back down for 8 months. Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. What changed? Maya was quiet. Then I found someone else's work under something, and it made me want to put something on top. Eleanor lifted the canvas from the easel and turned it. It was the house, the Hartwell house, painted in the loose, warm style of her books, full of life and the particular affection that makes illustrated places feel inhabited. The front porch had flowers on it that the real porch had never had. The windows were bright. A small figure stood in the doorway, indistinct. No features, just the shape of presence. I started it the week after I moved out, Eleanor said. I never finished it. I couldn't decide who was in the doorway. Maya crossed the threshold. Can I work in here? Not asking to own it, asking to occupy it temporarily, to be in it while it was still Eleanor's. Eleanor set the canvas back on the easel, face out this time, visible. I think that's exactly what it needs. The next 3 afternoons, Maya worked in the studio after school, and Claire gave her the privacy of it. She could see the skylight glowing from the kitchen window in the early dark of November afternoons, and that was enough. The fact of the light, the fact of Maya in it, choosing to be there. On the 3rd afternoon, Renata, the high school art teacher, stopped by and was apparently admitted because she was in the studio for 40 minutes before she came through the kitchen and told Claire that Maya had a specific quality of spatial intelligence in her work that was worth developing formally. She said it matter-of-factly, which was why Claire believed it. There was an arts program at the high school with a spring showing, and Renata wanted Maya in it. Owen arrived on a Saturday, 1 week before Thanksgiving, driven up from Portland by his grandmother. And he was small for 10, with his father's watchful quality deployed at a higher frequency. Where Marcus used stillness as patience, Owen used it as information gathering. Cataloging everything before committing to any response. He shook Claire's hand when introduced, which was not something 10-year-olds usually did, and which was clearly a practiced behavior he'd decided served him. Marcus had told her the full story by then, in pieces over the weeks of working alongside each other. His wife Laura killed in a traffic accident 3 years ago when Owen was 7. Marcus, in the months that followed, not being available, his word in the ways a child needed a parent to be available. The grandmother stepping in, 3 years of Marcus rebuilding himself into someone Owen could depend on, and the process still in progress, and Marcus honest about that. She had appreciated the honesty most of all. It was easier to trust someone who knew they were still in the middle of something than someone who claimed to be done. Eli appeared from the backyard approximately 45 seconds after Owen arrived, having apparently been watching from the yard rather than the house, and he assessed Owen with the quick, comprehensive scan of a kid who has been the new one enough times to know that first impressions are data. Do you want to see the treehouse? I've been redesigning it. I need someone who isn't my mom to tell me if the corner bracket on the east side is going to hold in high wind. Owen looked at him. Load-bearing or decorative? Load-bearing. It's a knee brace for the main platform. Owen appeared to decide something. Show me. They disappeared into the backyard together, and Marcus watched them go with an expression that was doing several things at once, the relief and the more complicated thing underneath it, the particular layered feeling of watching your child navigate the world, and knowing that you can prepare them and love them, and that the rest is entirely theirs to do. Maya's response to Owen was less immediate and more considered. She observed him for most of the first day, and Claire noticed her. Noticed the specific quality of attention Maya brought to it. Not wariness, not assessment exactly, but recognition. The second evening after dinner, Owen was sitting on the repaired porch steps while Eli drew revised treehouse plans at the camp table inside, and Maya came out and sat 2 steps above him with a book she wasn't really reading. Your dad talks about you all the time, she said without preamble. Not in a weird way, just like you're the thing that orients him. Owen looked at the yard. He talks about you guys too. Does that bother you? He considered this with visible seriousness. No, he's better now than before. I don't know what it is, but he's better. He looked at the yard a moment longer. So whatever it is, I don't think it bothers me. Maya turned a page she hadn't read. I'm not trying to replace anything. I just want you to know that. I know. Owen said it simply without performance. Your mom isn't either. She's just her own thing. Maya looked at him. He was 10, and he had said something precise and true, and she had the expression of someone who has been accurately described from an unexpected direction. She turned another unread page, and they sat on the porch in the November cold, and the conversation moved to other things. That evening, Maya took down the illustrated book Eleanor had given her weeks ago and sat beside Owen on the repaired living room floor and read it to him. Not because anyone asked, not because it was a gesture, because she was 14 and she recognized something in him that she'd needed someone to recognize in her, and she knew what to do about it. Thanksgiving morning arrived with frost on the yard, and the smell of coffee and the sound of the oven preheating for the first time since they'd restored it, and Maya was already in the kitchen. She was wearing the flannel she always wore when she was cold and didn't want to admit it, and she had the pie dough out and was working it with her hands in the way Claire's grandmother had taught them both heel of the hand fold turn, no overworking. She didn't explain herself when Claire came downstairs. She just moved over to make room. They worked in the kitchen for 2 hours before Eli woke up side by side in the rhythm of shared work that establishes its own language. The east window let in the low winter light and did exactly what the letter had promised. It told you the morning was still going to come. Claire thought about her grandmother writing that, choosing that specific window as the image for steadiness. And she thought about the fact that her grandmother had known this kitchen and carried it with her for decades, and had sent her here in some sense to find it again. I called Dad last night, Maya said, working the dough. Claire waited. I told him I was okay. I told him the house was getting good. She kept her hands moving. I didn't tell him about the festival or about drawing again. I don't know why. It just felt like something that was mine right now. That makes sense. He said he and Carla might move closer to Portland. A pause. I don't know how I feel about that yet. You don't have to know yet. I know. A longer pause. I think I'm okay, Mom. Not like fixed, but okay. She looked at the dough rather than at Claire. I think this is okay. Claire kept her hands on her own section of pastry and did not make it into more than it was, because Maya had offered it as a simple, true thing, and it deserved to be received as one. Me too, she said. Me too. Eli came downstairs 40 minutes later with his tablet in hand and the particular purposefulness of someone who has been awake and thinking for a while. Can I show you something? He sat at the camp table and opened a presentation, the school project he'd been working on, a slideshow he'd built about home and what it meant. He'd started with the Portland house, moved through the photographs of the Hartwell house as it had been on arrival, and built through the renovation, capturing the roof work, the community workday, the tile floor, the treehouse. The final slide was a photo Claire had taken in October of the three of them, plus Marcus on the front porch, the house behind them looking like itself for the first time, and Eli's narration for that slide read, "This is our home now. It's not perfect yet, but it's getting better every day, like us." Claire put her arm around him and held on. Miss Patterson said I should add more about the historical context. Eli said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "What do you think?" "I think the people part is more important than the history part." "I agree with you," she said. "I agree with you completely." The guests arrived in the early afternoon. Tom Gallagher with his wife and sweet potatoes that turned out to be magnificent. Jessie from the bookstore with wine and a story about the Hartwell house from her mother's childhood that she'd been meaning to tell Eleanor for 20 years. Renata Dana Webb. Jim Peterson. The house absorbed them all with an ease that no longer surprised Claire, but still moved her the way a place with the right proportions and the right history can hold more people than its square footage should logically accommodate. Eleanor arrived with Patrice and with Frank, who came in a wheelchair on the days when he could come, and this was one of those days. Frank was 83 and his eyes moved over things at a different pace than the room around him. Pausing on some objects and sliding past others, the internal logic of it belonging to a country Claire didn't have a map for. Patrice wheeled him through the repaired hallway, past the refinished stairs, past the original door hardware Claire had found and reinstalled. Then the afternoon light from the west window hid the entry at the angle it hit in late November, throwing long amber shapes across the floor that had been there for 90 years and would be there after everyone in this room was gone. Frank looked at the light on the floor. He looked at Eleanor. His voice was clear in the way it sometimes was the way a frequency comes in clean through interference on certain days. "Eleanor, we're home." Eleanor took his hand. There was nothing to say that was better than what he'd said. After dinner, after the plates had been cleared, and Owen and Eli had disappeared to the treehouse with flashlights, and Renata and Jessie had gone, and the house had settled into the warmth of a gathering. In its last hour, Claire stood on the back porch in the cold. The studio at the far end of the yard had its skylight dark now, but there was a drawing pinned to the inside of the window that she could see from here. Maya's recently made the composition visible even from a distance. She hadn't asked to see it yet. She would when Maya offered it. Marcus came out and stood beside her, and they looked at the yard together in the companionable silence they'd built over months of working near each other. The yard was not finished. The rose plants were bare-caned and waiting for spring. There was always more to do. That was the nature of a house, of a life, of anything worth maintaining. He reached into his jacket pocket and held out the duplicate key to the front door, the one he'd had made at the start of the project for access during the work week. "I kept this longer than I technically needed to," he said. She took it, held it alongside the brass key from Eleanor, which she'd been carrying in her pocket every day since Eleanor pressed it into her hand. "Two keys to the same door from different eras, both of them here now. The Winter Lights Festival," she said. "Next weekend. Would you bring Owen?" He looked at her. The look asked the question the words hadn't. "I'm not certain," she said before he could ask it. "But I bought a structurally unsound house with $47,000 when I wasn't certain, and that turned out to be the right call." She looked at the yard, at the studio window, at the oak tree with its treehouse occupied and lit. "I'm starting to think uncertainty is not the same thing as wrong." He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet she could hear Owen's voice from the treehouse and Eli's answering it, and through the closed back door the sound of the piano. The actual piano restored, and in tune now, being played by someone who had stopped playing for a year and had come back to it tonight without announcement, without ceremony. In the way that things you love come back when you've stopped demanding they return on a schedule. "Next Saturday," Marcus said. "We'll be there." She held both keys in her palm and looked at the house from the outside. the way she rarely did anymore from the back from a distance in the dark. The kitchen window was lit. The studio window was dark but held the drawing. The treehouse above the oak cast a small rectangle of flashlight glow onto the grass below. The house had been standing for 92 years and had held marriages and children and grief and work, and the particular slow continuity of a place that has been loved well. It had been empty for 2 years, and it had waited. It had cost $44,500, and all of her reserves and months of labor, and one very bad night in a flooded basement, and one daughter walking home through a storm, and one morning crouching over original tile and understanding that some things hold on. She would write in the house diary tonight. She'd been writing in it since October, adding to the record Robert Hartwell had started, and Eleanor had continued the ongoing account of what this house had required and received. Tonight's entry would be brief Thanksgiving. 15 people. All of the rooms in use at once for the first time. The east window in the morning, the floor holding. The keys were warm from her hand. She put them in her pocket and went back inside into the lit house, into the sound of it, into everything that was not finished and did not need to be.